The sun beat down mercilessly on Clayton Ridge as Ethan Morgan wiped sweat from his brow and surveyed his ranch. 6 years of back-breaking work had transformed this patch of Montana territory into something resembling prosperity. But the vast emptiness of his home struck him more painfully with each passing season. At 43, the former Union cavalry officer had built everything he'd dreamed of after the war, except someone to share it with. The weathered wooden house, sturdy barn, and growing herd of cattle meant nothing without companionship. Loneliness had driven him to do something he'd sworn he'd never consider: answering an advertisement for a mail-order bride. Ethan's weathered hands smoothed out the creased letter in his pocket, the one promising the arrival of Catherine Smith, described as a quiet, obedient young woman of good breeding and modest temperament. The stage was due today, and a knot formed in his stomach that had nothing to do with the beans he'd burned for breakfast. I'd like to ask everyone to subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from today? You're a damn fool, Morgan, he muttered to himself, leading his chestnut mare toward town. The thought of bringing a stranger, a woman no less, into his hard-won sanctuary left him uneasy. But winter was approaching, and another season alone might break him for good. Clayton Ridge had grown substantially since he'd first arrived, boasting a general store, 2 saloons, a small hotel, and even a church. Progress marched westward with the railroad, transforming frontier outposts into proper towns with alarming speed. Ethan had watched it all with a mixture of appreciation and wariness, valuing the convenience while missing the wildness that had first drawn him here. As he rode, his mind wandered to the woman who would soon arrive. The agency had sent a small daguerreotype showing a plain-faced young woman with downcast eyes. She seemed timid, which suited him fine. He needed a practical partnership, not some city woman with grand expectations he couldn't fulfill. Sheriff Tom Bradley nodded as Ethan dismounted outside the general store. "Today's the day, eh, Morgan?" The lawman's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Never thought I'd see you waiting on a mail-order bride." Tom was one of the few men Ethan considered a friend, having bonded over shared experiences in the war, though they'd fought on opposite sides. The former Confederate cavalry officer had proven himself a fair and capable sheriff, earning Ethan's respect despite their different backgrounds. "Heard the stage is running late. Wheel trouble near Beaver Creek." The sheriff spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Gives you time to get cleaned up proper. You smell like horse and look worse." Ethan grunted acknowledgement and headed toward the barber shop, suddenly conscious of his appearance. When had he last bothered with a proper haircut or shave? The bride would expect a respectable rancher, not some wild mountain man. The barber shop was mercifully empty when Ethan arrived. Old man Jenkins nodded silently and gestured to the chair. "Heard you're meeting someone today," he said, draping the cloth around Ethan's shoulders. News traveled fast in small towns. Jenkins had lost 2 sons in the war, fighting for the Union, and had moved west afterward, unable to bear the memories back home. Despite their limited conversations, Ethan respected the barber's skilled hands and discretion. "Make me presentable," Ethan replied gruffly, settling into the chair. As Jenkins worked, Ethan stared at his reflection in the spotted mirror. Deep lines creased his sun-weathered face, and silver threaded through his dark hair and beard. Would a young woman be disappointed by his appearance? He shoved the thought aside. This was a practical arrangement, not a love match. An hour later, Ethan stood on the boardwalk outside the hotel, freshly shaved and uncomfortable in his seldom-worn suit. The battered timepiece in his pocket showed nearly 3 o'clock. The stage should have arrived by now. Several townspeople lingered nearby, poorly disguising their interest in his situation. Mail-order brides weren't uncommon in the West, but Ethan's reputation as a loner made his case particularly intriguing gossip. Samuel Parker, the banker who'd foreclosed on more than one struggling homestead, tipped his hat with a smirk as he passed. "Quite a day for Clayton Ridge, Mr. Morgan. Gaining a new resident, are we?" Ethan gave a curt nod, unwilling to engage further with the man. Parker represented everything he disliked about the encroaching civilization. Men who profited from others' hardships while maintaining a veneer of respectability. The distant rumble of wheels and the crack of a whip announced the stage's arrival before it came into view. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as a cloud of dust preceded the coach into town. This was madness. He'd faced Confederate cavalry charges with less trepidation than he felt watching this approaching stagecoach. The driver pulled the team to a halt with practiced skill, and the passengers began to disembark. A traveling salesman, a young couple, and then finally, a woman in a dusty blue traveling dress stepped down. Ethan's carefully prepared greeting died in his throat. This couldn't be Catherine Smith. The woman who stood before him, brushing dust from her skirts with gloved hands, bore little resemblance to the meek figure in the daguerreotype. She was tall, with an upright posture that spoke of confidence rather than subservience. Her auburn hair, partially visible beneath her hat, caught the afternoon sunlight with hints of fire. But it was her eyes, bright, assessing, and unabashedly meeting his, that truly shocked him. "Mr. Morgan, I presume?" Her voice carried clearly across the space between them, the Eastern accent unmistakable, but her tone lacking the timidity he'd expected. When he failed to respond immediately, one eyebrow arched questioningly. "Unless I'm mistaken about the gentleman who arranged to meet Catherine Smith." Something in her expression suggested she found his stunned silence amusing. Ethan cleared his throat and stepped forward, extending his hand automatically. "Miss Smith, welcome to Clayton Ridge." Up close, he could see she was older than he'd anticipated, perhaps in her late 20s, rather than the barely 20 girl he'd been led to expect. Fine lines around her eyes suggested someone who smiled or perhaps frowned frequently, and her skin had a sun-touched quality unusual for Eastern women. "I am indeed Catherine Smith," she confirmed, taking his hand briefly. "Though most call me Kate." Ethan found himself oddly tongue-tied as he helped collect her luggage, 2 substantial trunks and a smaller valise. He'd prepared for a shy, overwhelmed girl he would need to reassure and guide. This self-possessed woman threw his carefully considered plans into disarray. The townsfolk weren't even pretending not to stare anymore, and he saw the sheriff watching the interaction with undisguised interest. "My ranch is about 5 miles outside town," he explained, securing her trunks to his wagon, which he'd left near the stagecoach office earlier. "We should get started if we want to arrive before dark." Kate nodded, appraising the wagon and his horse with an unexpectedly knowledgeable eye. "A fine animal," she remarked, stroking the mare's neck with confidence. "Morgan bloodlines?" Ethan blinked in surprise. "My family raised horses in Virginia before the war." The journey to the ranch began in uncomfortable silence. Kate sat beside him on the wagon seat, her back straight, eyes taking in the landscape with evident interest rather than apprehension. "It's beautiful country," she finally said, breaking the tension. "More open than I expected." Ethan nodded, uncertain how to proceed with this woman, who defied his expectations at every turn. "The valley opens up past that ridge," he pointed. "That's where my place sits." He found himself suddenly concerned about her reaction to his home. It was substantial by frontier standards, a 2-story cabin with a covered porch, smokehouse, barn, and corral, but hardly comparable to Eastern comforts. Kate continued to surprise him. "You've built all this yourself?" There was genuine admiration in her voice as the ranch came into view. "In 6 years," he confirmed, a touch of pride seeping into his voice despite his best efforts at stoicism. "Remarkable," she said, and seemed to mean it. As he helped her down from the wagon, their eyes met briefly, and Ethan felt an unexpected jolt of awareness. Kate Smith was not merely different from what he'd expected. She was magnetic in a way that made his pulse quicken and his hands unsteady. The sensation was unwelcome and unsettling. He'd arranged for a practical marriage, a partnership to combat loneliness and help manage the growing ranch. Attraction complicated matters in ways he hadn't prepared for. "I'll show you the house," he managed, carrying her smaller bag while 2 ranch hands he'd hired the previous year appeared to handle the trunks. Kate thanked the men by name after Ethan introduced them, her smile warm but composed. Even more disconcerting was how naturally she seemed to take in her surroundings, as though assessing the operation with a knowing eye rather than being overwhelmed by the rustic conditions. The interior of the house revealed Ethan's hasty preparations for her arrival. Fresh whitewash brightened the main room, new curtains hung at the windows, and he'd purchased a set of china plates to replace his tin ones. The feminine touches looked out of place among his sturdy, functional furnishings. "Your room is upstairs," he explained awkwardly. "I took the liberty of having Mrs. Bradley, the sheriff's wife, help prepare it." Kate nodded, following him up the narrow staircase to the bedroom he'd vacated in preparation for her arrival. He would sleep in the small room off the kitchen until after they were married. The bedroom contained a real bed with a new quilt, a washstand, and a mirrored dresser he'd ordered specially from Denver. "It's lovely," she said, running her fingers along the quilt. "You've been very thoughtful, Mr. Morgan." There was a gentleness in her voice that contrasted with her earlier confidence, and Ethan found himself even more confused by this complex woman who had arrived in place of the docile bride he'd expected. Kate unpacked her smaller bag methodically, while Ethan hovered uncertainly at the door. "I'll let you get settled," he finally said. "Supper in an hour, if that suits." She nodded, and he retreated downstairs, his mind racing. What had the marriage broker done? The woman upstairs seemed as surprised by their meeting as he was. Over a hastily prepared meal of salt pork and beans, awkward conversation revealed the truth. "I believe there may have been some misrepresentation on both sides," Kate said carefully, setting down her fork. "My cousin worked at the agency. She may have embellished my description and substituted her photograph for mine." She met his eyes directly. "Just as I suspect, you emphasized certain aspects of your situation while minimizing others. The assessment was so accurate that Ethan couldn't muster denial. He had described his ranch in the most favorable terms possible, mentioning the growing herd and comfortable house while omitting the isolation and harsh conditions. "Why did you come?" he asked finally. "If you knew it might not be as represented." Kate's expression grew more serious, a shadow crossing her face. "I needed a fresh start, away from Boston. There are limited options for a woman in my position." She straightened her shoulders. "I'm 30 years old, Mr. Morgan, considered firmly on the shelf back east. I was a nurse during the war, and afterward worked as a companion to a doctor's widow. When she died, I found myself without position or prospects." She hesitated before adding, "My outspokenness and education made me unsuitable for many households." Ethan absorbed this information, realizing how different she was from the young, malleable bride he'd requested. "And you thought frontier life would suit you better?" He couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. Her chin lifted slightly. "I thought a place still forming itself might have fewer rigid expectations." "Was I mistaken, Mr. Morgan?" The directness of her question demanded equal honesty. "I don't know," he admitted. "I expected someone—" He trailed off, unsure how to express his thoughts without offense. "Someone biddable, meek, grateful?" Kate supplied the words with surprising lack of bitterness. "Someone less like me, in other words." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "Shall I return to town tomorrow? I have enough funds for the stage back to Denver." The practical way she addressed their mutual disappointment was oddly refreshing. Most women of his acquaintance would have dissolved into tears or accusations. Ethan considered her offer, knowing the sensible response was to agree. This arrangement was clearly not what either had anticipated. Yet something made him hesitate. "Perhaps we're both being hasty," he said slowly. "You've traveled a long way, stayed a week, see the ranch, the area, then decide." Kate's surprised expression suggested she'd expected immediate rejection. "That's very reasonable of you, Mr. Morgan." She studied him with those discerning eyes. "Very well, 1 week, but I'll earn my keep during that time. I notice your garden needs attention, and I assume you could use help with preserving for winter." Ethan had intended to suggest she rest and adjust. Perhaps help with light indoor tasks, but her practical assessment of the ranch's needs spoke to her observant nature. "Agreed," he said, extending his hand across the table. When she took it, he again felt that unexpected spark of awareness, and from the slight widening of her eyes, he suspected she felt it too. As he released her hand, Ethan realized he was in dangerous territory. Kate Smith was nothing like the quiet, pliant wife he'd envisioned, but she was far more intriguing than he'd been prepared for. Dawn broke over the eastern hills, painting the kitchen in soft golden light as Ethan entered to find Kate already awake, coffee brewing on the stove. She wore a simple dress, with sleeves rolled up and an apron protecting the fabric. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," she greeted him, pouring coffee into the mug he habitually used. "I hope you don't mind. I'm accustomed to early risings." Ethan accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, disoriented by the domestic scene. In 6 years, he'd never walked into a warm kitchen with breakfast underway and a woman's presence transforming the space. "Habit from nursing," she explained, correctly reading his surprise. "When you spent years rising before dawn to tend the wounded, you find it impossible to lie abed once light appears." She moved efficiently around the kitchen, familiar with the layout despite having arrived only the previous day. Eggs sizzled in a cast-iron pan, and biscuits browned in the oven, a far cry from Ethan's usual breakfast of coffee and whatever remained from the previous night's supper. As they ate, Kate outlined her plans for the day with a directness he found oddly appealing. "I'd like to see the entire operation, if you're amenable. I should understand what I'm considering becoming part of." Her practical approach was refreshing, after his fears of a sheltered Eastern woman who would wilt under frontier conditions. After breakfast, Ethan showed her the property: the barn with its stalls for horses and milk cows, the chicken coop, smokehouse, and root cellar. Kate asked intelligent questions about the operation, occasionally offering observations that revealed surprising knowledge of agriculture and animal husbandry. "My uncle had a farm in Massachusetts," she explained when he commented on her familiarity with cattle. "I spent summers there as a girl." By midday, They had covered the immediate surroundings, and Ethan suggested they ride out to see the grazing lands where his growing herd fed. Kate's riding skills proved as unexpected as everything else about her. She mounted the gentle mare Ethan provided with practiced ease, adjusting her divided skirt to sit comfortably in the saddle. "I haven't ridden in years," she admitted, gathering the reins confidently. "But it's not a skill one forgets." As they rode across the valley, Ethan found himself pointing out features of the landscape with growing enthusiasm. The creek that never ran dry, the sheltered draw where cattle weathered winter storms, the distant mountains where he occasionally hunted elk and deer. Kate listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest. When they paused atop a rise overlooking the property, she turned to him with an expression of frank admiration. "You've created something remarkable here, Mr. Morgan, truly." Her sincerity caught him off guard, and he felt unaccustomed warmth spread through his chest at her words. The following days established a rhythm neither had anticipated. Kate rose early, preparing breakfast before throwing herself into ranch work with surprising vigor. She weeded and expanded the kitchen garden, helped preserve late summer vegetables, mended clothing, and even assisted with a difficult calving when one of the ranch hands sought help. Ethan observed her industry with growing respect and a troubling awareness that intensified with each passing day. Kate Smith was competent, intelligent, and possessed of a dry wit that emerged as they grew more comfortable with each other. She was also, he reluctantly admitted to himself, increasingly attractive to him. It wasn't merely her appearance, though her auburn hair caught fire in the sunlight, and her eyes sparkled when she was amused. It was her spirit, resilient, direct, and unbroken, despite whatever hardship she'd faced before coming west. On the fourth evening, they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant orange and purple. "Why did you really advertise for a bride?" Kate asked suddenly, breaking their comfortable silence. The directness of her question was typical of her, Ethan had learned. She disliked prevarication and approached most topics with refreshing honesty. He considered deflecting, but found himself answering truthfully instead. "Loneliness," he admitted, his voice rough. 6 years is a long time with only occasional human contact. I built all this." He gestured to the ranch spread before them, but found it meant nothing without someone to share it. The vulnerability of his confession surprised him. Kate nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than pitying, which he appreciated. "And you wanted someone biddable because," she prompted, still watching the fading sunset. "Because I'm set in my ways," Ethan replied after a long moment. "Because I thought it would be easier with someone who wouldn't challenge me at every turn." He glanced at her profile, illuminated by the last golden rays of sunlight. "I was a fool." Kate turned to meet his gaze, her expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "Perhaps not," she said quietly. "It's a hard life out here. Most women would struggle with the isolation, the work, the primitive conditions compared to Eastern comforts." She looked back toward the darkening landscape. "Including me, potentially." The admission seemed to cost her something in pride. "I'm not afraid of hard work or solitude, Mr. Morgan, but I won't pretend this transition would be simple, even for someone with my unconventional background." The honesty of her self-assessment increased his respect for her further. That night, Ethan lay awake long after retiring to his temporary quarters off the kitchen. Kate Smith was nothing like what he'd expected or thought he wanted. She challenged him, questioned his assumptions, and refused to be invisible. Yet in just a few days, she'd brought life to spaces that had felt hollow for years. The house smelled of bread and soap, rather than dust and neglect. The garden was beginning to thrive under her attention. Even his ranch hands worked with greater care, conscious of her observant eye. Most disconcertingly, Ethan found himself looking forward to their conversations, valuing her perspectives even when they differed from his own. He had wanted a silent, obedient partner to ease his loneliness without disrupting his carefully ordered existence. Instead, he had found a woman whose presence both unsettled and invigorated him in equal measure. Tomorrow marked the end of their agreed trial period. What would her decision be? And more troublingly, what did he want her to decide? Morning arrived with driving rain that forced them to remain indoors. Kate busied herself with mending, while Ethan attempted to focus on his account books at the table nearby. The enforced proximity heightened his awareness of her. The slight furrow between her brows as she concentrated, the graceful movement of her hands with needle and thread, the escaped tendril of auburn hair that brushed her cheek. "You're staring, Mr. Morgan," she observed without looking up from her work. Caught, Ethan cleared his throat awkwardly. "I was considering our arrangement," he admitted. Kate set aside her mending and met his gaze directly. "As was I. Today marks a week." The moment felt weightier than he'd anticipated. "Have you reached a decision?" he asked, surprised by the tension he felt awaiting their answer. She studied him for a long moment before responding. "I find myself at a crossroads," Kate said carefully. "This place, this life, it has merits I hadn't fully anticipated." She gestured toward the window, where rain lashed against the glass. "There's a raw beauty here, and purpose. The work is hard but meaningful." She hesitated before continuing. "But marriage is a serious commitment, Mr. Morgan, especially in a place so isolated. If we were to proceed, we would need absolute clarity about expectations." Ethan nodded, understanding her concerns. "What would you require?" he asked, genuinely curious about her terms. Kate's directness had influenced him more than he realized. She straightened in her chair, gathering her thoughts. "Partnership," she said finally. "True partnership. I would work alongside you, contribute to decisions regarding the ranch, and expect my opinions to be valued. I cannot be merely a convenience or a housekeeper with marital obligations." The forthrightness of her statement should have shocked him, but Ethan found himself nodding agreement. "And what would you offer in such a partnership?" he asked, his voice low. Kate didn't flinch from the question. "Loyalty, hard work, honesty, intelligence, skills you've already witnessed." She paused before adding quietly, "Companionship." The word carried implications beyond mere presence, and Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "And if we found ourselves incompatible after all?" He needed to address practical considerations despite the increasing pull he felt toward her. Kate's expression turned solemn. "Then we would face that challenge with the same honesty we're employing now. But I wouldn't enter this arrangement planning for its failure." Her practical approach to even this difficult topic reinforced his growing conviction that Kate Smith might be exactly what he needed, despite being nothing like what he'd thought he wanted. "I find myself revising my expectations," Ethan admitted, holding her gaze. "When you stepped off that stage, I was disappointed to see a woman so different from what I'd anticipated." He saw her stiffen slightly at his words, but continued. "I thought I wanted someone who would fit quietly into the spaces of my existing life, someone who wouldn't disrupt the patterns I'd established." He leaned forward slightly. "I was wrong." The simple declaration hung between them. In 1 week, You've identified improvements I never considered, spoken truths I needed to hear, and he hesitated, uncomfortable with emotional disclosure but pushing forward. Made this house feel more like a home than it has in 6 years. Kate's eyes widened slightly at his words, her expression softening. "Are you suggesting we proceed with our arrangement, Mr. Morgan?" she asked carefully. Ethan rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, a position he'd never imagined himself taking. "I'm suggesting something more authentic than our original arrangement," he said, taking her hand. "I'm suggesting we build something together, as true partners." Her fingers tightened around his. "This is rather sudden," she observed, though her tone lacked rejection. "We barely know each other." Ethan nodded acknowledgement. "True enough, but I know you're straightforward, capable, and unafraid of hard work. I know you see this land's potential as I do. I know your presence makes me think beyond mere survival to what this place could become." He drew a deep breath. "And I know that when you arrived, something unexpected happened. You made me tremble, Kate Smith. Not with fear, but with possibility." A hint of color touched Kate's cheeks at his words, but her gaze remained steady. "You've surprised me as well, Ethan Morgan," she admitted, using his given name for the first time. "I expected a hard man, inflexible and domineering. Instead, I found someone thoughtful, willing to reconsider his positions, and possessed of unexpected gentleness." She glanced down at their joined hands. "I came west seeking independence and purpose. I didn't expect to find connection as well." The admission seemed difficult for her, suggesting past disappointments Ethan could only guess at. "Will you stay?" he asked simply. "Will you marry me, not as the man who ordered a docile bride, but as the man who stands before you now, asking for a true partner?" Kate studied him for a long moment, as though searching for any sign of insincerity. Then, with characteristic directness, she nodded. "Yes," she said softly, "I will." Their wedding 2 weeks later was a simple affair in Clayton Ridge's small church. Sheriff Bradley stood as witness, along with his wife Martha, who had taken Kate under her wing during the preparations. The townsfolk turned out in surprising numbers, curious about the Eastern woman who had tamed the reclusive Ethan Morgan. Kate wore a blue dress rather than traditional white, practical yet beautiful, much like the woman herself. As they exchanged vows, Ethan found himself struck by how completely his expectations had been overturned. He had sought a silent, biddable wife to ease his loneliness without disrupting his life. Instead, he had found a fiery, capable partner who challenged him daily and made him better for it. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her with unexpected emotion, no longer trembling with uncertainty, but with anticipation of the life they would build together. As they drove back to the ranch, their ranch now, the setting sun gilded the landscape in golden light. Kate sat beside him, her hand occasionally brushing his on the reins. "Are you satisfied with your mail-order bride, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, a teasing light in her eyes. Ethan considered her question seriously. "Satisfied isn't the word I'd choose," he said finally. "Grateful, perhaps. Humbled, certainly." He glanced at her profile, struck again by how her presence had transformed his world in just a few short weeks. "I asked for someone who wouldn't disturb my carefully ordered existence. Instead, I got you, a woman who upended everything and made me realize how hollow that existence was." Kate's expression softened at his words. "And you, Mrs. Morgan? Do you regret answering that advertisement?" The new name sounded right somehow, despite her fierce independence. "Not at all," Kate replied, her voice warm with certainty. I came west seeking purpose and a fresh start. I found those things, and something I wasn't looking for as well. She met his gaze steadily, a partnership of equals. As their home came into view, silhouetted against the sunset, Ethan felt a sense of completion he'd never experienced before. He had built this place with his own hands, transforming wilderness into a working ranch through years of solitary effort. But Kate's arrival had revealed what was missing, not merely a woman's touch or companionship, but a true partner to share both burdens and joys. The fiery bride who had arrived on that stagecoach had indeed made him tremble, not with trepidation, but with the realization that his carefully constructed life had been merely a foundation. Together, they would build something far more meaningful upon it. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.